Hello everyone. What we're going to do in this quick lecture, we're going to go through an overview of plants. So what we'll talk about is, first of all, what are the general properties of these amazing living organisms that have been able to conquer pretty much every single place on Earth. So we'll talk about their evolution very quickly, and then the key step that made them so successful despite some limitation that I may have, like the fact that the RSSRs, they can move around. Despite that, again, they have been able to conquer all the different habitats almost on Earth. So what we'll talk about first of all is the generic characteristics. So we'll define what they are and what you find in all plants. Then we'll focus briefly on the plant life cycle. Then we talk about the evolution of the land plants, starting from an algae. And then finally, we'll focus in the second half of this lecture on the key steps on how they could overcome all the challenges that you probably can imagine an algae moving to dry land will have to face. So, what are we talking about here? First of all, we are talking about that group of animals that put all together in taxonomy within one of those 6 kingdoms, the one referred to as Plantae. So this is an extremely successful group of living organisms, as I said before, that have been able to basically conquer pretty much almost all the habitats on Earth. They can grow on rocks, as you can see here. They can grow on mountains. They can grow tall, short. You have all the different forms that you might want. So altogether, they make up about 300,000 types of living organism grouped in 10 phyla. Now, no matter what type of plants you're talking about, whether they're talking about the ancient plants or the most recent ones, they all share common properties, which are, first of all, they are all eukaryotes. So they all have nuclei, they have their organelles and so on. They're all multicellular. And also, you always find the cell walls in their own cells. Now, the cell wall may vary in composition, but they all have a cell wall. Second thing, they're all photoautotrophs. So like all autotrophs, they are able to produce their own food, and in their case, they harvest the energy coming from the sun, so the light coming from the sun, and therefore they're defined as photoautotrophs. They can move, they're non-motile, and therefore they're defined as sessile, so they're fixed in whatever location they are on land. And in a sexual point of view or in a life cycle point of view, they have a very interesting life cycle, similar to fungi and different from animals. We'll see in the next slide, but where they basically alternate generation of being diploid with generation being haploid, with both of them, at least in some plants, being able to generate actually full living organisms, as if they were independent organisms. And then another interesting thing of plants, which help them made very successful, is the fact that unlike some of their ancestors, they actually do retain their embryo inside one of these components of their life cycle called the gametophyte. And for this reason, since they keep the embryo inside the gametophyte, they're referred to as embryophyta. That's the group that they belong to. Now, talking about the life cycle. First of all, what do we talk about what do we mean by life cycle? What we mean is that series of events that basically lead from the birth of one organism to the birth of another organism with the same characteristics. Think about your own life, for example. What we will mean is all the events that take place from your birth until the birth of one of your kids. So there are different events taking place, right? When it comes to animal, we're used to see mostly the diploid form in the life cycle. Think about yourself. Look about yourself in the mirror. What you're looking at basically is your diploid form, right? We have 2 sets of chromosomes and so on. Despite that, and that will be our own phase right here. Despite that, we have organs where through meiosis we produce actually some haploid cells. That's what you will refer to as the haploid phase of our life cycle. In our case, these haploid cells are within ourselves. You don't really see them, right? And they're used to perform fertilization. So between a male and a female, still within the body of the female in our case. And this leads to the formation of another diploid organism. So in our case, the haploid phase is very, very limited. It's very short in our life cycle, right? In most animals, it's like that. In some animals, the sperm and the egg can actually be released, okay? But still, the haploid phase is very short compared to the diploid phase in general. This is different from plants. In plants, particularly in the early plants, see that the diploid phase and the haploid phase are actually fairly extended, almost equally originally. Then with time you'll see that diploid phase tend to become longer and longer in the most evolved plants, such as the angiosperm, the flowering plants, just to give you an idea. And not only that, but basically they can actually lead to the production of independent organism as haploid. Just using some wording here, when we talk about the diploid phase in plants, we're talking about what we call the sporophyte. This is the diploid, so it has two sets of chromosomes. And the reason why it's called sporophyte, because this is actually the form of the plant that, by meiosis, produce the spores. The spores are haploid, and you will see in some plants they actually can produce independent organism, meaning organisms that can even be separated from the sporophyte. They actually can fall on the ground and produce plants. But these plants, unlike the sporophyte, are haploid and they are called gametophytes. The reason why they're called gametophytes is because these are the plants that then by mitosis produce the gametes, still haploid, like the gametophyte. And then the gametes diffuse, going through the fertilization, produce a zygote and therefore reproduce the diploid phase. So the two phases in plants are almost equally, at least originally, or in general, the haploid phase tend to be much longer and much more recognizable than the one of animals. Let's go through one example here. This is what happened to ferns in the life cycle. Please notice one thing on this slide is that here the haploid and diploid phase are reversed compared to what you see on the schematic on the left. So when you think of fern, I'm pretty sure you're thinking about this plant right here. You can see it anywhere here in Ontario. For example, if you go to a forest, they sell them in all plant nurseries, see them everywhere. And this is the plant that we recognize as a fern, right? In reality, this is the diploid phase of the fern. That's what we call the sporophyte. So it's the diploid, and that's the one that produces spores. We'll talk about that in more detail when we talk about the vascular seedless plants that they belong to. So, but these are the plants that produce the spore, to the sporangium here, and then these spores they fall on the ground and actually give origin to separate plants, independent plants, which most likely you have probably pulled out from underneath a fern thinking that they are just weeds. No, these are actually plants. These are the gametophytes of the fern. So this is still a fern, okay? And the gametophyte is the haploid form of the fern, which then will produce, by mitosis at this point, will be producing the gametes, which then by fertilization will reproduce the diploid phase of the fern. So both phases here are fairly extended, and to the point that actually you have two different type of plants, if you want, even though you're talking about the same plants itself. It's just part of the life cycle. Now, let's talk a little bit about the evolution of plants. So, as all organisms on Earth, they still descend from the last common ancestor, or LUCA, here, last universal common ancestor here, which gave origin to organisms that can be grouped from a taxonomic point of view into three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So plants belong to the domain of eukarya, and more specifically belong to one of the four kingdoms which are part of eukarya, where you have protista. As you can see, this is not a single clade, so it's not a monophyletic type of group from a taxonomic point of view. If you don't remember, review the systematic lecture. and you can figure out if it is paraphyletic or polyphyletic. Then you have fungi, animals or animalia, and then you have plants. So it's one of the four kingdoms belonging to eukaryote. Now, plants have originated about 500 million years ago, 450 to 500 million years ago, from a green algae. Okay, so from water plants, basically, which then have moved on dry land, and then first formed very simple type of plants, plants that were tendentially short and didn't have a vascular system. So these are non-vascular plants, which are called bryophytes. Then, about 425 million years ago, some plants started developing a vascular system. This was a big achievement in the history of plants. Despite that, there were some plants that had vascular system, but they were still not producing seeds, and so that's what we'll talk, and that's what ferns belong to, the plants that we talked about in the previous slide. They're seedless plants, vascular seedless plants. And then, other big step in evolution was the production of seeds, which you can find in plants of about 350 million years ago, which can be divided into gymnosperm and angiosperm, and all of them together are referred to as vascular seed plants. So, as we say before, plants have most likely originated from an algae. An algae similar to the one you see right here. This is called chero. It's part of the cherophytes. These are algae that have different characteristics similar to the early plants. Okay, so the most ancient plants, the non-vascular plants. And among them, you can actually see how they start having already some sort of stem-like type of structure. But other than that, also they already had cellulose walls. They were able to make starch from using photosynthesis to produce starch, and they have chlorophylls A and B, similar to what you find in land plants. Now, what I want to focus on now on the rest of this introductory lecture on plants is what were the challenges that these plants had to face going from an algae from an aqueous environment to land, and how did they overcome? What were the key steps in the evolution of plants corresponding to addressing the different challenges? So, as you can imagine, there are several challenges that an algae brought to dry land would have to face, and in fact an algae would die over time, right? So what are these challenges? Well, when you are in an aqueous environment, you're first of all protected from rays that are coming through the atmosphere, so particularly UV rays, and therefore UV light. So once an algae comes out, that's one of the big problems. You get UV ray, you get damage from UV rays. Second thing is that obviously now you find yourself in an environment that doesn't have water around, and you tend to lose water, so you tend to dehydrate and desiccate. Third thing, you don't have physical support. So while in water, all your structure can be nicely spread out through the movement of water, right? Now you have gravity, you feel the gravity more, that crushes you down, right? So all the structures that in water are working well, now they're all compacted together, so they can't function as well as they were working before when they were spread out. Other thing is the nutrient uptake. When you are in water, whether you are moving around or you're attached to the ground, you still have, even if you're attached to the ground, you still have water moving around and bringing you some food, right? You may have some plankton, you can have other small fishes moving around, right? You don't have it on air. And last thing is that you have to reinvent if you want your way to reproduce. When you're in water, you may be releasing the sperm or the eggs. The water would carry them around even at long distances. Now you're on land. Oops. So at the beginning you still have to rely on water, and you see the early plants still had to rely on water. And then with time they develop pollen, right, or seeds, trying to spread their either their gametes or their early embryos at far distances. And so all of these had to be addressed. Okay, and so you'll see the stepstone, if you want, or keep steps in evolution of plants reflect the addressing of these issues here that we just talked about. At the beginning, many of them were actually the result of very quick, they had to be fairly corresponding to a fairly quick step in evolution, and many of them were actually generated through duplication of some genes, which then through cell mutation would have formed either other enzymes or other type of molecules that anyways could have basically address some of these, and we'll see some example right now. So the first challenge is you are now exposed to UV light. So how can plants do that? How can they do that? So well, this is an example of how, for example, duplication of some genes or just the addition of one enzyme, you just can address this problem. And the big step in plants to address the damage by UV light was the capacity to actually produce a group of molecules which are called phenyl polypropanoids. Similar to this one, in reality is a group of chemicals. Structurally speaking, if you look at this one, but also the derivatives from this one are similar to two known common amino acids or natural amino acids, which are phenylalanine and tyrosine. So you can see how overall the adaptation to the UV light and the protection so from UV light could have been a very simple step overall, where these plants had to ultimately invent or come out, maybe through duplication of the genome, with a new enzyme that could actually convert these amino acid into a phenyl polypropanoid here. These molecules are indeed able to protect from UV light because of the ring present here, which can absorb the UV light and therefore neutralize the negative or the toxic effect, or mutating effect of UV light. Other big step was the ability to prevent desiccation, so water loss. Most likely the first plants were actually incapable of controlling water loss and able to withstand loss of huge amount of water. So they would have been drought tolerant. Imagine this algae being washed to the shore and somehow evolving UV light resistance, staying there, finding some nutrients, at the same time still unable to prevent desiccation. So they could have stayed for a long period of time without water washing on top of them. So they would have had to be able to withstand drought fairly well. So these plants would have been defined as poikilohydric. Very terrible name, okay, to remember, but please do that. And then with time, they would have developed some mechanism to further prevent the water loss, to minimize, to reduce this 90% to less and less and less. How did they do that? Well, we already discussed this when we were talking about photosynthesis in BIO358. If you remember, we were talking about how plants had to deal with two things, the issue with rubisco and dehydration, right? So, and how they were doing it? By producing a waxy layer, referred to as cuticle, and by developing stomata. What are we talking about here? Just to remind you, so when we talk about cuticle, we're talking about this wax layer, lipidic layer, that is deposited on top of it, the leaves or the epidermis of the plants, which basically being a lipid, it's hydrophobic and therefore prevents the movement of water from the inside, from the epidermis to the outside. So that's the first step in the evolution, trying to prevent dehydration. The second step in more recent plants was the development of stomata. There are these openings here formed by two cells which can open and close. These are usually found on the bottom part of the leaves, if you remember, and they are open at night when it's cooler in the air, and therefore you have less chance of losing water. And so these are those open that prevent the water loss, but also the exchange, if you remember, of carbon dioxide, and allow the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen within the inside the outside. Now, another big challenge for plants to move from water to land was to find ways to get nutrients. And this was addressed or has been addressed with cumulative steps throughout the evolution. The first step was to develop some sort of symbiotic relationship with fungi. A relationship that's referred to as mycorrhizae. You see the word right here. So basically what happened, fungi were already present on land before plant got there. And most likely what would have happened at the beginning is that the first algae or the first land plants would have formed this symbiotic relationship with these fungi which were already diffused in the ground, which would have been beneficial to both of them, right? So obviously it's not as, hey, you want to be friend. They brought, this happened by chance, and it was established in the long run because both organisms were benefiting from that. What were the benefits that we're getting? Well, plants at this point would have got the fungi would have helped basically since they were already extended within the ground. This is one example of the mycorrhizae, by the way. These are all microfilaments that you can see underground corresponding to the fungi, producing a network similar to what roots are, right? A network within the ground, and therefore because of this network now this fungi can take so many minerals, water from this ground here and pass it to each other. So now if they have established this mycorrhizae with the plants, basically what they would do, they would actually be bringing these nutrients, right, and these salt minerals to the roots of the plants or the rhizoids originally of the plants. So the plants would have benefit by getting the nutrients and the minerals from the fungi. At the same time, the plants, being photosynthetic, they would have actually exchanged some of their carbon molecules with the fungi. So the fungi would have had a source of nutrients. By the way, this type of relationship is established between the fungi that can either penetrate the roots or even go inside the cell in the root cells here. So it's a very tight relationship between this organism. So that's the first step that took place in the early plants to actually increase the amount of nutrients that the plants could have been picking up. So this relationship with fungi. Then over time, plants, the first plants, as I mentioned before, were now vascular. So if you look at moss, which is still around nowadays, these are non-vascular plants. Okay, they don't have any vessel to carry material around. Then later on in time, some plants start developing what we call vascular system. Okay, now there are two types of vascular system nowadays: the xylem and the phloem. There are different types also in terms of structure. We'll talk about that when we talk about the structure of plants. And they have also different function. So the xylem would have been the original one and was developed mostly to transport water through the body. Okay, so water and the nutrients in the water. Okay, whereas the phloem is instead developed to actually move the product of photosynthesis around, the sugar through the plant body. And their difference between them is reflected also in terms of structure. The xylem would tend to form larger pipes, basically, which move the liquids in one way only, so from the roots through the stem of the plant, so upward. Whereas the phloem is actually able, is first of all made by smaller type of tubes or structures there, and can actually move the material both directionally, moving the product of photosynthesis, all the nutrients in both directions. Now, together with that, plants to overcome one thing. First of all, the vascular system needs support. Okay, you can't have something that will collapse. These tubes here cannot collapse. And so the other thing is that plants, in order to gather more and more food, they have to be able to grow in height. The higher you get, the higher is your chance also to get light and produce more nutrients, right? And so in order to do that, they had to develop another molecule, which is referred to as lignin, which could give them strength overall. Interestingly enough, lignin is nothing else than a polymer, a complex polymer of a molecule that was already developed to protect them from UV light. So a molecule that was already there. So it's polypropanoids here. So it's nothing else than polymer of phenyl polypropanoids here. So all they had really to develop in order to acquire more strength and produce lignin was some additional enzyme that could actually put these phenylpropanoids together, creating this much stronger polymer here, which is now found in the cell membrane, in the cell wall, strengthening the plants. Together with that, also plants develop, again, in order to maximize the amount of nutrients that they can create by photosynthesis, they want to grow tall. Not only that, but they want to also expand their roots so that they can get as much food as possible to go a larger distance. You are sessile, you can't move around, you have to go to the food. The food is not going to come to you. You can't go. What do? You expand. You try to get as far as you can within the ground or within the air. And to do that, they develop what is called the meristems or apical meristems. These are basically group of undifferentiated cells, it's like embryonic cells, which can form all the other structure in the plants. They're found at the apex, so as you can see, either at the top of the plants, or there are nodes where you can find them, where the branching takes place or the leaves are formed. And then you have them also at the tip of the roots. So basically these, again, these are cells that are undifferentiated, can form all the other tissues found in the plants, the three tissues, we'll talk about that, found in the plants. By doing that, allow for the growth of the plant basically vertically, or both outside or both inside the ground. So by doing that, by developing these tissue, plants could actually sustain further growth, higher in stuff. Obviously with growth and also with the requirement for more nutrients, plants also had to develop an anchoring system which corresponds to the roots, right? The early plants did not have roots. The non-vascular plants, mosses, they have what we call rhizoids. Rhizoids are just very hairy-like structures. All they do, they just anchor the plant to the upper layer of the ground. And in fact, if you think about moss, it's so easy to take out. And that's the reason why also moss doesn't grows on rocks, right? Doesn't need much dirt to actually anchor itself. It doesn't have roots. It has rhizoids, right? That's what non-vascular plants had. Vascular plants now, they had to develop roots, as we said before, to increase their anchoring so they could grow taller at the same time, and also to increase the absorption of water and nutrients from the soil to sustain the production of their food through the photosynthesis. And so they develop roots and what we call root system. Root system is basically all the roots put together and correspond to the part of the plants which is underground. It's different from what we mean by shoot system. This slide just shows you the difference, first of all, between rhizoids. So this is what a moss look like if you look carefully to it. So very short plant is very small in reality, and then it has this hair-like structure which all they do, they just ground the plants to a very thin layer, very superficial layer of dirt. They're not involved in carrying much nutrients in. These are different from the roots. Roots can be two types. We'll talk about that when we talk about the structural plants. It can be either top roots, that's what a carrot is, all right, for example, and these they tend to grow, or if you think about dandelions, they have top roots, are those very annoying type of roots that go very deep into the ground, very hard to pick up, to take out fully. In fact, that's the problem with dandelions, right? That's why you use those little shovel to get them out, or a knife to get them all out. And or you can have fibrous roots, which instead they extend more horizontally. They go deep, but they can also go horizontally. That's what you find in trees, and they're actually great, for example, to stabilize the ground, unlike taproot. And just to clarify, what the root system is, basically all the roots combined together, so all the part of the plant which is underground, whereas the shoot system, we're referring to all the structures, so leaves, the stem, and so on, the branches, they are found on the outside of the plant. When it comes to the shoot system, now again, through the apical meristem, now it has acquired the capacity to grow taller and taller over time. That's why we have now big trees and so on. At the same time, obviously, it has evolved in parallel with lignin, which could give it strength, so they could sustain the effect, obviously, of wind, gravity from falling down. And now, it gives obviously a big advantage. The taller gives a big advantage to the plants, not only because they can produce more food, but also because the taller they are, the better they can disseminate their spores. Think about the pollen. When the tree releases the pollen, if they were very short, they will release it only to very narrow areas. Whereas being tall, you can actually spread it with the wind very, very far away. And that's a big advantage because at that point, you may allow to mix your own pollen with other plants which are far away, which may have a different genetic pool. You create more variability. Now, together with that, also plants have developed leaves. Leaves which have increased greatly the capacity to produce organic compounds through photosynthesis. Now, there are two types of leaves, and they have evolved in two different separate steps. It's an example of parallel evolution, if you recall, when we're talking about evolution. We're talking about the different types, convergent, divergent, parallel. So this is an example of parallel evolution. And the type of leaves that you can find, they're referred to as microphyls. These are basically single leaves, okay, which have only one vein. And megaphyls, instead, they are the larger, the blade-like leaves, the common leaves, what you would think first, probably as a leaf, larger, and they have several veins inside. You see that the structure is different from them. Now, microphyls are the first type of leaves to be developed. They were developed in very early organisms, and basically they've evolved as offshoots coming in from the vertical axis. So the vertical axis would have had some vascular tissue here, and then these through the stem would have originated some outgrowth on the side. The same thing for the vascular inside, and these later on would have acquired the capacity to perform photosynthesis, forming this type of microphyls, these almost needle-like type of leaves. These are different from the megaphyls. The megaphyls in reality will be the product of several steps in evolution. First, the plants for the vertical axis would have had to acquire the ability to form some branching, which would have been followed by the formation of, or in parallel with the formation of vascular system within these branches here. And then you would have had that some of these branches would have developed the photosynthetic tissue in between them, forming what we call the blade of the leaf blade. And so these leaves were in the end look like, or they still look like, a blade made by photosynthetic tissue. We'll talk about the structure in the future lectures, and they would have multiple vessels originating from the original branches that they came from. Another big trend from an evolutionary point of view has been a reproductive trend. Reproductive trend or life cycles trend, first of all, a big change has been the shortening, progressive shortening of the haploid phase. You'll see, we'll talk about the different group of plants, so we'll talk about the bryophytes, the non-vascular plants first, like mosses and lycophytes. Then we'll talk about the vascular seedless plants, like ferns, right here. Then we'll talk about gymnosperms and then angiosperm here. And you will see that their life cycle becomes more and more with the sporophytes, so the diploid form becoming more and more dominant over time, taking a much longer period of time compared to the haploid form. Okay. Now, also, and the reason being that, I don't know if you remember when we were talking about polyploidy as a mechanism of speciation, a quick mechanism of speciation, and how it's used by farmers, and we're talking about how having more chromosome actually ultimately, or more copies of the same chromosome plants, makes them more resistant to different things, including drought, but also mutations. Now, if you have a single copy of a gene, right, like you have in the haploid form, you're very sensitive to mutation, because if a mutation damages an essential gene there, you're done. You don't have an alternative copy. if you have two or more of them, like in tetraploid plants, but in this case we're talking about diploid form here. If you have two of them, even if a mutation, let's say, make one of the alleles completely inactive, you still have the other one that can protect you. Okay, and so that's the big advantage of getting the diploid phase in the life cycle longer and longer. Now, together with that, plants also have start developing over time the capacity to form, so the sporangium, so the diploid form, the sporophyte, the diploid form here, with time has acquired the capacity to actually start producing two different types of spores, a male and a female spore, which then would have formed two different types of gametophytes, a male and a female gametophytes, which then will produce a female and a male gametes, and then that will form, by fertilization, reform the sporophyte. What is the advantage of that? The advantage of that is that by doing that, particularly if this comes together with mechanism that prevents self-pollination or self-fertilization ultimately, now you have a way to spread your gene, mix your genes if you want with other plants. You are increasing the genetic variability, which again, from an evolutionary point of view, increases your chance of survival. And now, so there are two plants that came out over time. Plants are referred to as homospores. These are the older, if you think, type of plants. And basically, they will be still producing, their sporophyte will be producing only one type of spore, which will produce a gametophyte, which is bisexual. So it will produce both the sperm and the eggs, which then will fertilize and reproduce the plant. Now, these are plants that usually, they will require water to spread, and therefore their sperm will go to very short distances. This is very limited for genetic variability. Other plants instead would have become heterosporous. So they would have been able to produce, at this point, the sporophyte will produce two types of spores, which then on the ground will produce, or within the plants, they produce two different types of gametophytes, a female and a male gametophyte. The megaspores are the spores that produce the female gametophyte. The microspores are the one that produce the male gametophyte. And then these will produce, the female will produce the egg, the male will produce the sperm, which then will become the pollen in the end. And then in the history, then this sperm becoming pollen would actually have been able to be brought also at higher distances without the need of water, carried by the wind, increasing again the chance of producing genetic variability by being brought to female gametes. So this is a slide that summarizes the difference ultimately between homosporous and heterosporous plants, and I'll show you a picture later on of a difference in the sporophyte between them. So, but this will be the cycle of a homosporous plant. That's the one I showed you originally, where you have the sporophyte that produce only one type of spore by meiosis, and therefore only one type of gametophyte, which will produce both the male and female gametes, so the sperm and the egg. Usually these plants are limited because the sperm is still requiring water to move. Most likely they will self-fertilize, reproducing the sporophyte, but having limited genetic variability. Whereas heterosporous plant, there you would have the sporophyte, so the diploid phase, which could produce by meiosis both the male and the female spore. Think about flowers, for example, right? And so that will be angiosperms. And then the male spore will produce, which looks like a small spore, so a microspore, whereas the female one looks larger, is a megaspore. I'll show you in the next picture what I mean. The male spore, the microspore, will produce the male gametophyte, the haploid form. The female spore, so the megaspore, will produce the female gametophyte, still haploid. Both of them independently, by mitosis, will produce the sperm, the male gamete, and the egg, the female gamete. So at this point, now you may have that the male gamete will fertilize either the same female gamete, limited variability there, or, for example, if you're talking about pollen that can be spread through the air, could actually be flowed to a different plant and fertilize the egg of a different plant. therefore increasing the genetic variability of the zygote that will be formed, which then would turn into again the sporophyte, so the diploid plant. This is what we mean by micro and macrospore. So this is a plant, this is a homosporous plant. So this will be this type of plant right here. Homosporous plants, if you look, these are where the spores are produced, a sporangium, these are called. They produce the only one type of spore. They're all the same size here. This is instead a heterospores type of plant. Has two types of sporangia here. One that produce microspores, these are the male spores, and others that produce the macrospores, which are the females one. So these will give origin to the male gametophyte. This will give origin to the female gametophyte later on. So in summary, what did we talk about in this overview of plants? First, we talk about the genetic characteristic of plants. We talk about the kingdom they belong to, that they are all multicellular or eukaryotes with a cell wall, and so on. Then we talk about the plant life cycle. We went into the differences between the animal and the life plant cycle, particularly stressing on the fact on how the sporophyte, so the diploid form, and the gametophyte, the haploid form, they're actually very different from each other, very clear different phases within the cycle, differently from animals. Then we talked about the evolution of land plants. We talked about the different challenges that were on the way for land plants to go from an algae to the variety that we see nowadays. So we talked about the first non-vascular plants, how they developed ultimately the ability to overcome UV damage, the dehydration, how the strategies through the formation of vasculature, through the formation of an apical meristem, and the root system, and how so they the leaves and so on, how they improve ultimately their ability to nourish themselves and grow. And then we talked about how the overall plants change, if you want, the reproductive cycle, shortening the gametophyte part. Not only that, but also going from homosporous to heterosporous, and therefore producing different type of gametophytes, which led the way ultimately to the formation of different type of gametes, pollen, and an increased ability to mix their genetics or create more genetic variability overall. And sorry, I skipped this part here. We talked about also the evolution of plants, just give you the different steps and how first we had non-vascular plants, which are the bryophytes, which developed about 450 to 500 million years ago. Then about 425 million years ago, the vascular seedless plants appear, so like the ferns. And then about 360 million years ago, we had finally the vascular seed plants, which include gymnosperms, which do not produce flowers, and the angiosperms that produce flower coming out from there.